I rise today on a matter of personal and collective privilege to highlight once again the need to build our community's resilience to disaster and climate risks. When Nenita Consolacion saw her two children in the rubble, they were lifeless, but what struck her most was the sight of her beloved children still holding hands until the end. In between sobs, she narrated how she lost her children when on that fateful day of November 8, 2013, the wind suddenly grew strong, water entered their house, at first ankle deep, then quickly rising, and the next thing she knew, her two children were drowned by the rising floodwaters. Nenita lived to painfully tell her story, but more than 6,000 others are now just part of the statistics. They were not fortunate enough to survive Super Typhoon Yolanda, said to be the world's strongest typhoon to make landfall. Mr. President, this year's IDDR celebration carries the slogan, Live to Tell, and focuses on reducing global disaster mortality, the first of the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. If only communities on the path of Yolanda were prepared, if only they were evacuated in safe areas ahead of time, if only people knew what a storm surge meant and how they could have escaped its wrath, more people could have survived and testified how disaster risk reduction and preparedness can save lives. There are many more if-onlys and what-ifs, but finger-wagging will not give justice to the dead. We need to turn the lessons of Yolanda and other disasters into urgent climate action to build resilience. All over the world, there are many other Nenitas from tragedies of even greater magnitude, such as a 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that claimed 230,000 lives, the 2008 Cyclone Nargis that claimed 130,000 deaths, that struck Myanmar and cost 138,000 deaths, and the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that killed 223,000 deaths or individuals. The Emergency Events Database of the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters recorded 7,056 disasters worldwide during the period 1996 to 2015. Natural hazards in the past 20 years killed 1.35 million people, more than half died in earthquakes, and the remaining due to weather and climate-related hazards. In the Philippines, deaths caused by storms alone reached 15,880 during the period 2006 to 2015, significantly higher than the 3,970 storm deaths in the previous decade. The community of nations realized that they must come together and craft a global framework that will serve as guide towards addressing risks and building resilience to disasters. In 2005, governments around the world adopted the Yogo Framework for Action, or the HFA, aimed at substantially reducing disaster losses in lives and in the social, economic, and environmental assets of communities and countries by the year 2015. Among the 5 priority actions of HFA, making disaster risk reduction a policy priority and strengthening institutions has progressed the most. Here in our country, the passage of landmark legislation on disaster and climate risk management, the Climate Change Act of 2009, as amended by the People's Survival Fund of 2012, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. These have institutionalized and mainstreamed disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in development policies, plans, and programs, as well as in public funding. However, translating policies into action is a different issue altogether. Even with the HFA, the past decade saw disasters continue to exact a very heavy toll. A staggering 1.5 billion people in the world were affected in various ways, including more than 700,000 killed by disasters. The total economic loss was more than $1.3 trillion. In 2015, at the third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction led nations in crafting a new framework that focuses on a more targeted approach to effectively guide nations and communities in managing risks and preventing the creation of new risks. The Sendai framework for DRR outlines 7 global targets to be achieved by 2030. First, substantially reduce global disaster mortality. Second, substantially reduce the number of affected people globally. Third, reduce direct economic loss in relation to global GDP. Substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and the disruption of basic services. Substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. Substantially enhance international cooperation to developing nations. Substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk reduction information assessments. In the first year of the Sendai framework, we are asked, what are we doing to implement the first target to reduce mortality? The UNISDR cited as an example the Metropolitan Manila Development Authority's Metro Manila Shake Drill, an annual earthquake drill launched in 2015 that aims to prepare citizens and communities in the event the big one occurs. According to the 2004 Metro Manila Earthquake Impact Reduction Study, or the MAMIRES of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake in Metro Manila may destroy 40,000 of residential buildings, cause 34,000 deaths, injure 114,000 individuals, and the ensuing fires may also result in 18,000 additional fatalities. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, PHIVOLCS, already warned that a West Valley fault is ripe for movement. We just cannot predict when it will happen. Meanwhile, we have been experiencing harsher storms and monsoon rains, stronger episodes of El Nino in the past years due to climate change. In the face of imminent threats and the new norm, we cannot do business as usual. We must invest in disaster risk reduction. It has been estimated that the economic impact of disasters will be reduced by $7 for every $1 spent on DRR. Mr. President, in my capacity as your chairperson of the Committee on Finance, we were able to transform the 2016 budget into one that is climate adaptive and disaster resilient. Under the 2016 GAA, the implementation of programs, projects, and activities should contribute towards preventing the creation of new disaster risks, reducing existing disaster risks, building the resilience of local communities and the nation as a whole, towards achieving the goals under the Sendai framework for DRR, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, adopted last September 2015, and the country's intended nationally determined commitments. We have mainstreamed provisions that ensure that the implementation of government programs would contribute towards building resilience, including on the maintenance and operation of dams, repair and retrofitting of public infrastructure, the resilience of agricultural communities, and the building of evacuation centers in every region of the country. We likewise reiterated the enforcement of our environmental laws to strengthen disaster resilience. We will continue, with your support, to do this in the 2017 national budget. But how do we translate these policies into programs that will actually reduce measurable disaster risks? It is critical that we strengthen our adaptation actions at national and local levels. Examples of these are preparing risk assessment, protecting our ecosystems, improving agricultural methods, managing water resources, building settlements in safe zones, developing early warning systems, instituting better building designs, improving insurance coverage, and developing social safety nets. Engaging rural people in decision-making, especially to understand autonomous adaptation and the interplay of informal and formal institutions, plays an important role in strengthening public decision-making. Reducing disaster risk is key to poverty eradication and sustainable development. We need to strengthen local risk governance, enhance the resilience of rural livelihoods, preserve the integrity of our ecosystems, and promote the resilience of culture and indigenous peoples. The Sendai framework for DRR urges us not to manage disasters, but to manage the risks so that natural hazards would not turn into disasters. There are many more Nenitas in the world who were given a second chance to live and tell a painful story that could hopefully touch hearts and enlighten minds about the urgent need to make disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation a priority of government. I hope we could all heed the call for action. Let us all take a proactive role in making the Sendai framework work for us. Let us prove that our nation remains steadfast in its commitment to building a more resilient and sustainable planet. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we refer the. Yes, may we recognize Senator Hontiveros?
Mr. President, I'm sorry. No, please, ladies first. Mine is just a manifestation of support.
Majority Leader, who shall I recognize?
Senator Hontiveros, Mr. President.
Senator Hontiveros is
Ladies
recognized.
first, ladies
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader and the good senator from Bukidnon. Would the good senator from, as Senator Gordon said yesterday, from everywhere, yield to a few questions?
Yes, it would be my pleasure to answer the queries of the good senator from everywhere, too, who has been very supportive and joining me in our budget hearings as well.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Senator, Mr. President, rather, I picked up my ears when the good senator mentioned not just disaster risk reduction, but another way of wording it, managing the risks from disasters.
Yes.
Because as the good senator, I'm sure is aware, there's also that field within disaster risk reduction of disaster management for health. Which according to not just the Sendai strategy, but references such as the World Health Organization, the Health Protection Agency, and the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, is built on the premise that the health of the people is inextricably linked to the health of the environment. So I wonder, Mr. President, what the good senator thinks are a few or is one of the most important links between the health of a population and our capacity to reduce the risks of disaster to us or to enable us to be more resilient and responsive in responding to these disasters.
Definitely, Mr. President, when we speak about reducing risk, that would inextricably and inevitably refer to health hazards as well, because every environment hazard is a health hazard as well. What am I referring to? Something as basic as water, potable water, and sanitation. The non-availability or the absence of these, even during times when there are no natural hazards, no storms, no storm surges, no floods, would be a risk to the health and a risk to the environment. During times of typhoons or habagat, when there is flooding, the proliferation of disease, dengue, cholera, malaria, and all the vector-borne diseases. This happens all the time, and if we don't even clean our surroundings, we are afflicted with all these vector-borne diseases. So, and who are the most vulnerable populations when it comes to these hazards? It's the women and the children. Yung ina ng tahanan na siya pa mismo ang nag-iigib ng tubig para sa kanyang pamilya. Siya ang nag-aaruga sa kanyang mga anak. Siya ang naghahanap ng malinis na tubig para magluto para sa kanyang nagugutom na pamilya, pati na ang kanyang asawa. These everyday happenings occur in many places in Metro Manila and in rural areas in the country. Just yesterday, in our Department of Health Finance meeting, it shocks us to learn, Mr. President, that in this day and age, 8% of our population do not have private toilet facilities. In fact, 8 million of our population do open defecation. And so it is part of our advocacy on reducing risk by hopefully funding what is needed by next year, by 2017. So there is no Filipino family that is deprived of a toilet because it is simply a society that does not recognize the basic human rights. It is an inhumane society to allow 8 million people to openly defecate. This is a big risk, I think, in terms of our sanitation, in terms of living in a healthy community. And so the good lady senator is correct in linking disaster risk reduction with health and environmental safety as well.
Indeed, Mr. President, as the WHO Assistant Director General for Emergencies articulated, the framework is really that health and disaster risk reduction, so health including sanitation, as the good senator gave a specific example of, health and disaster risk reduction are deeply connected. Because he said healthy people are resilient people, and resilient people recover more quickly from disasters. Returning, Mr. President, to the major reference to Sendai made by the good senator.
Yes.
Experts stressed during that Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai in 2015 that resilient health systems can reduce underlying vulnerability, protect health facilities and services, and scale up the response to meet the wide-ranging health needs in disasters. So ibig mong sabihin, Mr. President, when our health systems are
If they're in
enabled,
place,
if
yes.
they are in
If they're
place,
capable.
and they have a high capacity,
Correct.
they also deliver better results in terms of our disaster
Yes.
preparedness and response.
You're correct.
Mr. President.
It simply means that if our barangay health centers are equipped with the necessary equipment to check the the patients within the community, if our DOH hospitals are equipped with the equipment needed to maintain a healthy population, if we have barangay health workers who are trained what to do during the times of an emergency, if we know how to respond in times of floods, in times of tsunami, in times of storm surge, in times of earthquakes. So having the infrastructure, whether in terms of buildings, big or small, health center in the barangay or a provincial or regional hospital, but also having the personnel who are trained of thinking 10 steps ahead, of not only in responding after the storm has hit, but actually are pre-positioned in the areas which are vulnerable, in areas which are predicted to be hit by strong winds, gusty winds, or typhoons. This is very important. And that is the reason why the NDREAMC law had changed the previously named calamity fund into the NDREAM fund, where a portion of it is actually used or allowed to be used for the pre-positioning of equipment, personnel, and services, so that it would not only be response-oriented. And this deals a lot with the health sector.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a last question,
There are two sessions going on.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, Mr. President. As a last question, at least for this afternoon's interpellation of the privileged speech. And then in closing, I'll just put two further questions on the record for further deliberations. But as a last question for this afternoon, Mr. President, healthcare systems provide core capacities for disaster risk management for health, especially on two major points. It said that countries with well-developed systems are often much more resilient and better prepared for disasters, especially on these two major plans, Mr. President. First, primary health care. Primary health care focuses on basic services to improve health status, which in turn builds communities' resilience and provides the foundation for responding to emergencies. And secondly, community-based actions, such as the ones being described by the good senator. Community-based actions are at the front line of protecting health in emergencies. So I'd just like to seek the wisdom of the good senator, Mr. President, how she believes that a focus on primary health care and on community-based actions both enable the community to better prepare for and better respond to disasters.
Yes, Mr. President. In fact, the presence of a DRR officer in every municipality is so important, and that is already part of the law. Let's even go into the smaller political units. If every barangay would have a DRR officer, if every purok or sitio would have a DRR officer. If you noticed the slide earlier, when I showed the slide of San Francisco Municipality in Camotes Island, they were at the eye of Typhoon Haiyan, but there was zero casualty because the mayor and the councilors in the area were DRR engaged. They prepared food packs, they evacuated families in the vulnerable areas, by the coastal areas, and they did not have any support from the national government, but it was a community-driven, local, community-based climate action that they did, and there was zero casualty. There are many more examples of those local communities who don't need much resources, but just have to have a change of mindset. So if a municipality in the Visayas can do that, I am certain that other areas of our country can replicate this feat as well. And so I say it because we keep on having the same number of deaths, the same number of casualties, and so much to rehabilitate after a natural hazard strikes. As I said in my last sentence, these natural hazards don't have to turn into disasters if we are prepared.
Thank you to the good senator. And in closing, Mr. President, I'd just like to put on record two more questions that perhaps the Committee on Finance can treat of more as we consider the budgets of the Department of Health, DNR, and the whole proposed General Appropriations Act. The first of these questions, Mr. President, is, as the chair of the Committee on Finance, could the good senator give any interventions to help the Department of Health to ensure that our hospitals are resilient, that infrastructure will be preserved even in times of calamity? And lastly, Mr. President, how can women be further involved in DRRM planning and implementation?
Oh, those are
Thank
very
you to
good
the
questions
senator.
because, in fact, first on your question on hospitals, I believe it was 3 years ago. I can give you a copy of my privileged speech. There was a Safe Hospital campaign of the UNISDR, and the Safe Hospital campaign should have been integrated into how the DOH would manage its hospitals, but perhaps it would be good and instructional to actually have this as a special provision in the DOH budget in reference to their preparedness insofar as the DOH hospitals is concerned. Now, second, gender and climate change, or gender and DRR. This is every inch a gender issue. As I said, it is the women who bear the brunt of disasters because we are considered a vulnerable population. It is the women who have difficulty in trying to cope in the aftermath of a disaster. And so preparing women, again, this can be an activity perhaps of the Philippine Commission on Women, the National Commission on Women. There could be a special provision for that. We can also request the ILG through the local government academy to prepare a curriculum for preparedness, for DRR, especially for perhaps women LGU leaders or even women community leaders to prepare a curriculum so that they can be BRR aware.
Thank you, good Senator.
I thank you for
Mr.
your very
President.
enlightened interventions and would appreciate special provisions that you may request or that you may introduce as we do the General Appropriations Act. Thank you.
Mr. President, may I move to recognize Senator Migsubiri for a manifestation without asking Senator Legarda to give up the floor because there will be an interpellation thereafter from Senator De Lima. So Senator Subiri.
Senator Subiri is recognized
Thank
to give his manifestation.
Thank you. I have no further questions. I have no questions, rather, to ask the good senator from Antique and the Republic of the Philippines. I would just like to associate myself with her speech together with Senator Alan Cayetano, who mentioned earlier, to mention him as a supporter of her message and advocacy, together with Senator Joel Villanueva, who also went up to me and said that he supports the climate change advocacies of Senator Loren Legarda. It's obvious that Senator Loren Legarda is our climate change advocate. She is our Miss Climate Change. And Senator Gordon is our Mr. Disaster, being the chairperson of the Philippine Red Cross. So they go hand in hand. But levity aside, Mr. President, I'm glad that we have someone like her in this chamber that tirelessly fights for her climate change advocacies and climate change mitigation. And I'm not saying that because she's also the chairperson of the Committee on Finance. Thank you, Mr. President.
I appreciate the kind comments of the senator from Bukidnon.
Thank you, Senator Subiri.
And I don't want to go head on with Mr. Senator Disaster.
Don't worry, Mr.
What's the
President.
pleasure of Senator
I'm
Gordon?
not going to create a disaster, Mr. President, but the remarks of the gentleman from Bukidnon are really in aid of budget insertion. In other words, nagsisip-sip siya doon sa chairman ng Committee on Finance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President.
Thank you for that manifestation, Senator Gordon.
Mr.
Majority
President,
Leader,
may we recognize Senator De Lima.
Senator De Lima is recognized for interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. Will the good senator, the noted and renowned pro-environment champion of the Senate and of the country,
It would
yield
be
to
my
just one
honor,
question?
Mr. President, my pleasure to answer the interpellations, the questions of the good senator from Bicol and the Philippines.
It's actually just one question. May we know the position of the good senator on the Paris Agreement on climate change, or the otherwise known as the Paris Climate Pact?
Yes.
We all know the backdrop of this agreement.
Of course.
And we know the status of
Yes.
this agreement.
I'm glad that the good senator had brought it to our attention, Mr. President. In fact, I was in New York as co-head of delegation on April 22. I've been advocating this for decades, since I was a young journalist, Mr. President. The status of the Paris Agreement is, it is with the executive. It is supposed to be transmitted to the Committee on Foreign Relations, chaired by Senator Cayetano. I'd spoken to Senator Alan about it, and as soon as it is transmitted to the chamber, he is willing and will sponsor the Paris Agreement. I know that there are several certificates of concurrence that are being awaited by the Climate Change Commission. The DFA is also very supportive of this, as clarified by Secretary Yasay during our budget hearing. And tomorrow we have the budget of the Climate Change Commission, if the good senator wishes to join this representation, so that we can have a briefing on the status of the agreement. We know that by November 4, this will come into effect, because this agreement says that if 55% of nations
Would ratify.
ratify it, then it would be into force. And so, while we are awaiting the ratification of the Philippine Senate, because it has not yet been transmitted to us, it will be enforced already. Let me just state, Mr. President, that our submissions of the intended nationally determined commitments are conditioned or pegged on technical and financial assistance, meaning the 70% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that we had introduced as an INDC is conditioned on technical and financial assistance, meaning that those who will say, why is the Philippines supposed to mitigate when we are only a 0.3% emitter in the world? Itatagalog ko po para simple. Tayo ay isang mahirap na bansa, tayo ay hindi naman sanhi ng nangyayaring pagbabago ng klima dahil tayo naman ay hindi nagsimula nito. Ang Estados Unidos, ang bansang China, ang India, ang European Union, sila, pagsasama-samahin natin ang kanilang greenhouse gas emissions, ang sanhi ng pagbabago ng klima. Ngayon, bakit tayo magmimitigate? Ang ibig sabihin po ng mitigate, bakit natin kailangan bawasan ang ating pagbubuga ng greenhouse gas emissions kung tayo ay isang mahirap na bansa? Will this stymie economic development? The answer, Mr. President, is that no, this will not stymie our economic development. As I said, being a 0.3% emitter in the world only means that even if we are a non-emitter in the world, it would be to our advantage because we can access the Green Climate Fund where billions of dollars await vulnerable nations like the Philippines.
We thank the good senator for enlightening us on the benefits, on the wisdom of the Paris Climate Pact, that indeed we are a signatory and it would be very good if we ratify this agreement. So
May I also-
my question really
Yes.
is, is the good
Yes.
senator supporting the ratification
Of
of
course.
that
Yes,
agreement?
Mr. President, I am not only supporting the agreement, I have also committed to the former UNFCCC head Secretary General Christiana Figueras, who may have lost in her bid for the United Nations Secretary General because the Portuguese, Mr. Gutierrez won as Secretary General, but Christiana is a good friend. She was a UNFCCC head, and I had committed that I will help her in her campaign for Mission 2020, Mission 2020, which is to compel nations, especially those emitting greenhouse gas emissions, the industrialized nations, to abide by the Paris Agreement. As I said, on November 4, it will be in effect. In fact, 75 countries, including the European Union, have already ratified the agreement. It is historic that both the United States and China have ratified the agreement, and I think more than 55%. We already have about 63% of total emissions if you put together all the countries that have ratified the agreement.
Thank you. That's all I wanted, a commitment from the good senator that is going to really push for the ratification of this agreement, as
Yes,
I
Mr.
will.
President.
I would want to be with you in that, the hearing, the committee hearing
Yes.
tomorrow, but unfortunately, there is a hearing on the Committee on Justice. So, but I'll be glad to go over all the other, the
Yes.
documents.
I really thank you for your questions because it is important that everyone understands that even if we are not a major emitter in the world,
Correct.
we, the agreement is not all about mitigation. It is about mitigation and adaptation. And adaptation means giving us the technical and financial assistance to do flood controls, to do early warning systems, to help our vulnerable populations, including our indigenous people, 15 million of them, of the 100 million population, to help the most rural areas who don't have electricity. There's so much that we could do with the funds that will come from the Green Climate Fund. In fact, small island states, Fiji, did Maldives ratify it? Grenadines, Palau, so many island states who are also non-emitters in the world have ratified it earlier than the Philippines. But of course, the ratification process may be simpler. Maybe it's a matter of signature of their minister, but here in the Philippines, the timing was not very good because the previous administration did not finish the process of ratification because it was a campaign season, and it was inked on April 22. There was only session for a few days. We could not tackle it,
No
and there
time.
was no transmission done to the Senate.
Thank you. Indeed, there's so much to benefit
Yes.
from that agreement if we so ratify.
And nothing
Thank you
to
so much.
lose.
Thank you, Mr. President.